Papa, uniform 259er, 119er, break. Enemy is unaware of our presence at this time, over. Solid copy. Hitman 2-3, Echo 5, Foxtrot.
Hey everybody, this is Ben Powers coming at you from the Commander's Voice. My guest tonight is Mr. Henry Sledge. He is the son of the famed Eugene Sledge, author of With the Old Breed, a book about World War II combat with the United States Marine Corps in the Pacific, specifically combat on Peleliu Island and on Okinawa. So Henry, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, hey Ben, it's a pleasure to be here, man. Thanks for having me.
It's really exciting to have you on. A good friend of the show, George Lutz, had been on your podcast and recommended that we get together, and we had a good conversation pre-show. So I'm really excited to get rolling on this. So the first question I have is, and it's kind of open-ended. For folks who may not know who your dad is, although I'll be surprised anybody who's into World War II history doesn't, could you give a little bit of background on, what his World War II experience was and what led him to write his book?
Yeah, of course. So my dad was Eugene Sledge. He was author of With the Old Breed. He was a 60 millimeter mortarman in the 3rd Battalion, in K Company, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines of the 1st Marine Division. He trained at Pavuvu when he first got into the Pacific Theater in March of 1944. And then his first campaign was Peleliu, September of 44. Came back to Pavuvu after that to rest, refit, retrain for Okinawa, which was spring of 45. And then he was on North China occupation duty after Okinawa for 6 months, and then he came home. He had a career as a biology professor, post-war, married my mom in 1952, had my older brother and me. He had kept notes throughout the war on little slips of paper, probably little ration cards, range cards, pieces of paper tucked into his New Testament Bible, which he carried through the entire war. And he fleshed out an outline from that in the years shortly after he got home. And then from that began writing his own manuscript, if you will, what he intended to become his own memoir of fighting the Japanese as a 60 millimeter mortarman, infantryman, and sometimes rifleman in World War II. And he had no intentions of writing that book to garner self-aggrandizement or personal fame. It was just, I think, somewhat a cathartic process. And as he told me when we talked about it many times when I was a kid, he was writing it for the family. He was putting something down on paper so that my brother and I and my mom would have some understanding of what he had endured, what he had seen.
Oh, understood. So going back to when you said he trained on Pavuvu and was at Peleliu and Okinawa, so he obviously joined the Corps somewhat later in the war. And
He did, yeah.
If memory serves, now he was a academically inclined, obviously became a professor later in life, but also, and correct me if I'm wrong, he actually was not in the best of health either. It's not like he was gonna definitely be drafted or anything like that. He probably could have avoided infantry combat if he'd been so inclined. Is that correct?
Yeah, it is correct for probably, well, when my dad had rheumatic fever and malaria as a child, and in fact, he was very sickly as a child. His 5th grade year, he pretty much missed out on. He was home in a wheelchair. And then it took him a year or two to get back up to full robust health after being able to get back into school after missing an entire year from malaria and rheumatic fever. Those illnesses left him with a heart murmur, which, when the story as it was told in the family after the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor and he wanted to enlist to do his part, my grandfather, who was a physician, said, well, you got a heart murmur. I mean, the Marine Corps, and my dad wanted to be a Marine. They were a sharp outfit. They were the best, the finest. That appealed to him. He wanted to be a Marine. And my grandfather said, well, you've got a heart murmur. They'll never take you. And some of this was portrayed in the miniseries. And of course, they had to do artistic license and compress certain things and draw certain things out, and that's just to be expected. But they portrayed it very well. I mean, my father asked him, "Will you check me out?" And he went to my grandfather's office in downtown Mobile, and my grandfather gave him a physical examination. And I mean, can you imagine, having to tell your youngest child, "I pronounce you fit to go be thrown into the service of your country and essentially be cannon fodder"?
I actually can't imagine that at all. I think I'd be very tempted to say, "Oh yeah, that heart murmur's still there." To be
Yeah,
honest,
but but in a way, that makes the Eugene Sledge story, I think, so powerful and compelling, because my grandfather was a man of certain influence. Okay, he he was he was not without powerful friends. He himself had a fair amount of influence. It was always believed in the family, had my dad chosen, my grandfather probably could have gotten him a stateside posting, like, working as a radar technician at Brookley Field, just outside of Mobile, and there would have been nothing wrong with that. He would have been serving his country, doing his job. There would have been absolutely nothing wrong with that. But my father wanted to be at the, shall we say, sharp end of the spear.
sure
And
thing.
to have had those physical limitations as a younger child, I mean, once he got over that, he lived a very robust lifestyle. I mean, he hunted, he had a horse, he rode horseback, he spent a lot of time out in the woods. He deer hunted with my grandfather. They hunted duck, they hunted squirrels. Um, he lived a very outdoor oriented life. So I would definitely not say that he was limited physically by the time he graduated high school in 1941. But when he first, my grandfather implored him to go in as an officer. And so rather than just immediately enlisting, he went into an officer's training program at Georgia Tech with the agreement that with a proviso that he would come out of that and be an officer. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Well, he and this is all in With the Old Breed, his book. He and the majority of the class were becoming really frustrated and felt that they were going to miss out on all the action, so they purposely flunked themselves out so that they could get overseas and get into the fight, because he was afraid the war would, yeah, I can't say it with a straight face, but
No,
I
I
remember
got
how
you.
he talked about it. He was afraid the war would be over before he had a chance to do his bit.
So, having had the chance to have these conversations with your dad, when I read the book, it's the combat experience of a very young man, a very sincere young man, but written as an older gentleman in the hindsight of having been through those experiences. But what I never get out of the book was like a gung-ho boy's own adventure kind of thing. It seems like your dad had a very good idea of what he was going to get himself involved in. Not maybe how horrific and how soul draining combat was going to be, but he seems like a man with very few illusions even before he goes to combat. Is that an accurate read though? Or what did he share with you when you had those conversations?
He was. I have heard some veterans say that we had no idea what we were getting ourselves into. I never heard him say that as such. He was a perspicacious young man. He had a high degree of intellectual awareness. He was not. I mean, I guess in some ways you could say he was naive, but in other ways he was not. Um, and yet, all that being said, Ben, I mean, I know, as he wrote so eloquently and With the Old Breed, something in him died at Peleliu, and that was the basic belief that man was essentially good. But that's kind of skipping ahead. I never heard him say, "Oh, I had no idea what I was doing. I just thought we'd put on a uniform and carry some cool gear around and have an adventure." He never saw it like that.
Yes, sir.
And I really don't think many of them did. I think they all knew it was deadly serious business. But as I also heard my dad say, when the first shell went over, I felt like, man, my place is back home with mother.
Understood. Since you brought up Peleliu already, and so I'd like to kind of get right into it. For folks who might not have an understanding of, World War II island hopping and the Marine Corps' role, could you give a little rundown of what happened at Peleliu?
Well, yeah, Peleliu is on the western edge of the Pacific. It's a small island. It's the southernmost of the Palau Island chain. Peleliu, 2 miles by 6 miles. It's a very small island. To this day, it is very undeveloped. I went there in 1999, but it fit into the overall strategic picture of World War II. The Japanese had a very large air base there. It was geographically, it was very important to the Japanese because it was a stopover point between any Japanese naval air forces, any naval air assets traveling from the Philippines to, say, Truk, because it was in between both. But it was a very vibrant, active base. The northern Palau Islands had tens of thousands of Japanese, well, probably about 25,000 Japanese troops up an hour north, hour and a half north of Peleliu. But Peleliu was the whole reason that the United States determined it was necessary to invade Peleliu and secure it for our own use was because of the Japanese air base there. But Douglas MacArthur was advancing on the Philippines along a southwestern axis through the Pacific, and it was determined by the fall of 1944 that Peleliu's airfield could be a threat to his flank as he advanced on the Philippines. So it was determined we needed to neutralize the airfield on Peleliu so that MacArthur's flank would be protected. As it turned out, MacArthur was moving faster than expected because our overall timetable in the Pacific was moving faster than expected at that point. And so they were still grinding it out on Peleliu when he did, in fact, make it to the Philippines. And that ended up kind of being a sad irony in itself because, these guys, the Marines knew, and there were soldiers there too from the 81st Infantry Division, the Wildcat Division. That was the Army division that reinforced the Marines on Peleliu. These guys knew why they were there. They'd been told, we've got to protect MacArthur's flank. And they also then knew that MacArthur was able to make it to the Philippines while they were still fighting this horrific war of attrition or battle of attrition in the caves of Peleliu.
Yes, sir.
But Peleliu was defended by some very crack Japanese troops that had done duty in Manchuria previously. These guys were not first timers. They were not third stringers. They knew what they were about. And the other thing that makes Peleliu, or that made Peleliu such a compelling story, they thought going in that it was going to be a rough but fast battle. 3 days, maybe 4, in and out. Kind of like Tarawa, which was no cakewalk by any means. But Tarawa was viciously defended, but I don't think there were any surprises on Tarawa, okay? Yes, there was a horrific loss of life. Yes, it was a horrific battle, but I don't think, strategically speaking, there were any surprises. Well, Peleliu had probably one of the most geographically and topographically complex ridge systems and cave systems that had yet been seen in the Pacific. Okay. Pre-invasion intelligence had not completely revealed all of that. There was still a lot of vegetation on the island that obscured a great deal of the ridge system. And even if they were able to see some of the ridge system, they just didn't know that the Japanese had dug probably 500 plus caves on Peleliu and fortified. They had interlocking fields of fire, fortified positions, mutually defending positions from which to protect themselves and to fight the Marines. And it was just, it became a horrific war of attrition because we were not expecting that, especially when the Marines had been told going in, it's going to be rough but fast. And then as they advanced further inland from D+1 on and began to find out really what they were up against when they got into the ridges and into the mountains and caves, it just became a killing field. And the other thing that made it tough, Ben, was the fact that there had been a doctrinal shift on the part of the Japanese that rather than fight the Marines out and soldiers out in the open, fight from a position of defense and depth.
Yes, sir.
And whereas before in certain battles in the Pacific, we had seen very hard, very close fighting for a period of time, and then they would have banzai charges. That had been seen many times across the Pacific. Well, on Peleliu, if you were Kunio Nakagawa, Colonel Nakagawa, who's the base commander or the garrison commander on Peleliu, your marching orders were, don't pull banzai charges, fight from a position of defense and depth, fortify every position, make the Marines pay in blood for every yard of territory that they take. And the Japanese at that point were discouraged from pulling banzai charges because they began to realize the futility of it. And so there were none on Peleliu. And of course, Marines wanted there to be banzai charges because, get out in the open, they could kill them en masse and end the battle quicker. But the Japanese had learned by that point, and that was the last thing they were going to do, So it was just, it was a confluence of some very unfortunate factors. Poor pre-invasion intelligence, unexpectedly difficult terrain, a doctrinal shift on the part of the Japanese, and these things, conflated, and it just was a very unpleasant situation strategically and tactically to have to deal with, not to mention the 115-degree heat and shortage of water.
Yes, sir. It's just remarkable to think, like you said, you get 2 mile by 6 mile island, that you would think that by the time you got an amphibious core onto that there wouldn't be a 3-foot square patch for a guy to stand on by the time you got everybody in there. But apparently by going subterranean, that made it a much more difficult objective to take. Did from what your father wrote, or for what he explained to you, or just from your own research, how did the Corps deal with that doctrinal shift? I.e., they think they're going to have 3 hard days of fighting, but they're going to take the objective and then be able to, seize and hold the terrain. And it turns out, instead of, being met at the waterline and going kinetic right from the start, they kind of get sucked in. And then now they're dealing with, like you said, unanticipated terrain. The fact that these guys are very well dug in, and it's a more rugged defense to take. Did they alter their tactics, techniques, and procedures on the ground, or did they just grind it out with the way they had been trained and eventually exhaust the Japanese? Exactly how did they crack the nut?
Well, I would say, first of all, and what you say is correct. However, like luring the Marines in, that happened at Iwo Jima. They let them get now the landing was viciously opposed, but not at first. Peleliu, from before the first wave, before the Amtraks of the first wave hit the beach, Peleliu was viciously opposed. Okay. But it was a combination of the two. The landing was viciously opposed, but they were still luring the Marines in, and that warfare of attrition was going to occur, in subsequent stages. Whereas, like on Iwo Jima, they let them get ashore en masse and then really hit them. And I'm no expert on Iwo Jima by any means, but to get to your question of how did the Marines deal with it, I mean, I could give a really pithy, simple answer and say what my dad said, which was, well, had it not been for the flamethrower, they probably couldn't have conquered the territory they needed to conquer. But, the flamethrower was a very crucial and necessary weapon. And it certainly played its role at Peleliu. And I would agree. I don't think they could have neutralized the K positions that they did without it. But in a broader strategic sense, a broader tactical sense, I guess, to try to answer that question, at first it was just grinding it out day by day by day. Well, in the process of doing that, the 1st Marines, meaning the 1st Marine Regiment, because it was the 1st Regiment, the 3rd, and the 5th, with the 11th being artillery, the 1st Marines were the first unit to really take on the Umerbrogel mountain range, or which is where the heavily in place cave system was. My dad was in the 5th Marines, obviously. They were a little bit further south, and then the 7th Marines were to their right on the southernmost part of the island. After about a week, the 1st Marines under Chesty Puller were pretty much shot to pieces and rendered, because of their casualties, just pretty much rendered combat ineffective. They were, and I'm not sure exactly what day it was, when the 1st Marines were taken out of the line by General Geiger, Roy S. Geiger was the Amphibious Corps commander, who was Rupertus's boss, and General Rupertus was 1st Marine Division commander. But then the 7th Marines began attacking the Umabrogel mountain range at that point, and then the 5th Marines went in last. Well, the 7th Marines sustained horrific casualties, just like the 1st Marines. And then by the time they had to be pulled back and reinforced by the 5th Marines, at that point, General Rupertus pretty much went to Colonel Bucky Harris, who was 5th Marines regimental commander, and just said, look, you always find a way to get it done. We're not getting it done. We can't seem to crack this nut. I've lost the 1st. The 7th is about to go. Just get it done. Well, what Bucky Harris did, and much to his credit, I mean, I know my dad wrote him a letter after the war and essentially thanked him for probably saving their lives. Bucky Harris, 5th Marines commander, he took the approach. He said, okay, if we're going to go in and eliminate these positions, we can't just, fix bayonets and go charging up to cave mouths. That's just going to get Marines killed. That's lunacy. What we've got to do is pull back, use sandbags, use firepower, use air power. At that point, we had superb air support in the form of VMF 114, which is Marine Fighter Squadron 114. They were doing a fantastic job of flying in with their Corsairs, dropping 1,000-pound bombs, dropping napalm. They were doing a fantastic job of providing close air support. Colonel Harris's attitude, or Colonel Harris's approach, was let's pull back, use our air power, use firepower, use sandbags. Let's protect our guys. Let's use as much firepower as we need, not just 105s and 75 millimeter pack howitzers, but 155, 155 millimeter long toms, and they were getting those things up. They were manhandling those things up into the ridges and firing into these Japanese positions as close as they could. And so they were doing as much of that as possible to soften up the enemy before they sent Marines in to start trying to, eliminate the positions one by one. They were also coordinating really well with their armor. But the 1st Marine Tank Battalion had to be taken out after about a week and sent back to Pavuvu. But the Army 710th Tank Battalion was there and provided excellent support. And Marine infantry worked beautifully with the tanks of the 710th Tank Battalion, going up into some of those positions. I know in the Horseshoe, which was a valley bordered, of course, by the cave system on Peleliu, there were some really beautifully coordinated tank infantry assaults in that region. But that's how they finally got it. And it after about 31 days in action, the Marines were pulled out, and the 81st Infantry Division was left to finish the job. And it took them about another 6 weeks. I mean, it was well into November, and the 1st Marine Division was back on Pavuvu. It was well into November before the 81st Division finally had all Japanese resistance completely snuffed out. Now, Army reinforcements were brought in before that point. I forget the actual date. I should have looked it up and scribbled it down, but these things just run together in my head after reading about it so much. But the General Rupertus, I mean, it's very well documented that he did not want to bring in Army reinforcements, but General Geiger, who was 5th Amphibious Corps commander, just finally overruled him and said, look, we've got to have all the help we can have, and the 81st Division had already taken Angara, which was a very small island about 6 miles south of Peleliu. And it was not really heavily defended, but there was some very vicious fighting there. But they had neutralized that island, and they were brought over to reinforce the Marines on Peleliu.
Bracket. So it sounds like Colonel Harris had a tremendous appreciation for true combined arms fighting, and maybe because of the initial assessment of the objective, the idea of a combined arms fight with a lot of indirect fire support wasn't seen as necessary because they thought it was going to be a 72-hour operation, and maybe he had time to adjust his thinking. I don't want to put words in your mouth or rewrite history, but I don't know whether he had the doctrinal training to be thinking combined arms, or if he was just a smart guy who knew how to put it all together on the ground.
Well, and I mean, this is where I have to say, Ben, I mean, I've done a lot of research on this because I'm interested in it. It's my pleasure to read about it. I'm not a professional military historian, so I don't want to get out of my lane here, but I'm sure all of the regimental commanders had combined arms training. It's just that I think as it was such a highly fluid situation once they got ashore. And again, with the prediction, it's going to be rough but fast. I mean, we'll be out of there in 3 days. I mean, guys are going in saying, man, I can stand on my head for 3 days. I can take anything for 3 days. There were, I think, 46 news correspondents out on the troop ships, most of whom did not go ashore when they heard that optimistic prediction, because they thought, well, there's not going to be anything to see here. A few did go ashore, but most of them did not, and that was very unfortunate, and probably contributed to the fact that for so many years Peleliu was, not a very well-known battle. Even though it was a resounding American victory, it was such a Pyrrhic victory. It was so costly, it didn't have that. I hesitate to use the word the term, that good feeling, because nothing against the Japanese in World War II was easy. It was all horrific. Not that Europe was easy either. My God, young men were dying every day, and that was a tragedy in itself. But sometimes you go in and you win a game, and you just roll over the enemy, and it just feels good to win it. And then sometimes you almost get your own ass kicked in the process, but you still win. But you got a bunch of injured guys on the bench, but you still won. So Peleliu was incredibly, horrifically costly. But the sheer fortitude of certainly the 1st Marine Division, and I don't want to leave the 81st U.S. Army Infantry Division out either. The determination, the grit, the fortitude, it couldn't have been done without that. Okay.
Certainly. And so this is obviously this is a place where your father becomes a changed man. This is where he realized that man is not inherently good. He saw a lot of brutal things. In the book especially, does he address Peleliu specifically? Well, obviously he addresses it specifically because the book is about his experiences on Peleliu and Okinawa, but in terms as a turning point in his development as a Marine, it made him a combat Marine, it made him a veteran. What was his takeaway from Peleliu?
Well, his takeaway from Peleliu was that he remembered his training. It was his first combat experience, and it was probably in some ways more than he bargained for. But I tell you what, Ben, if I could, there's a very short passage here that I'd like to read that's bullet points of what he felt he did take away from Peleliu, if that would be okay.
Please do.
Okay, so this is actually on page 157 of With the Old Breed. This is my very well thumbed, beat up copy that I use for all my own projects and everything. But okay, so here I'm reading his words. To this private first class, Peleliu was also a vindication of Marine Corps training, particularly at boot camp. I speak only from a personal viewpoint and make no generalizations, but for me, in the final analysis, Peleliu was 30 days of severe, unrelenting, inhuman, emotional, and physical stress, proof that I could trust and depend completely on the Marine on each side of me and on our leadership, proof that I could use my weapon and equipment efficiently under severe stress, and proof that the critical factor in combat stress is duration of the combat rather than the severity.
There it is. That seems like a summation that you would have at the staff college for planners to think about, future. So that's amazing.
Here's a great sentence, and I don't know if any of your listeners are drill instructors or hoping to be, or have friends who are drill instructors. I assume you've got a lot of listeners who are military personnel, but this is what my dad said about his drill instructor. He said, boot camp taught me that I was expected to excel or try to, even under stress. My drill instructor was a small man. He didn't have a big mouth. He was neither cruel nor sadistic. He wasn't a bully, but he was a strict disciplinarian, a total realist about our future, and an absolute perfectionist dedicated to excellence. To him, more than to my disciplined home life, a year of college ROTC before boot camp, and months of infantry training afterward, I attribute my ability to have withstood the stress of Peleliu.
There it is. That's a ringing endorsement of the Marine Corps drill instructor right there. That's amazing.
And he says, I mean, it's really cool. And there's a little bit more about this in the unpublished material that I've researched, as you know. As they were loading up on trucks and driving away to go down to the harbor in San Diego and board troop ships to head out to the Pacific. I mean, my dad, you know, he had a high degree of emotional intelligence. I mean, he was watching Corporal Doherty because their drill instructor was Corporal Doherty. He was not a sergeant, he was a corporal. And Doherty was standing there watching him leave him. My dad was ruminating about, you know, I was wondering what was going through his mind. And he said, I did not like him. I had no love for the man at all, but I realized he was teaching us deadly business and we had to pay attention and respect it. And so he said, I didn't like him, but I damn sure respected him.
Roger that. Understood. So I'm assuming that your dad carried these lessons over to him in Okinawa, which is again talking about a not just intense but long duration battle. So what
82 days for him, yeah.
It was, so we're talking like almost 3 times as long,
Mm-hmm.
which is just absolutely, I can't even imagine what those men were subjected to. So the book itself, does it spend more time focused on Okinawa, or is it divide its time fairly evenly between the two? I'm assuming Okinawa has the lion's share of the writing just because of the duration of the combat.
Yeah, you know, I'm flipping through it as we talk, and I'm really enjoying this conversation. By the way, you're asking some great questions. It's pretty evenly divided between the two, Ben, but yeah, I'd say it's pretty evenly divided.
Gotcha.
You know,
so,
and that.
Oh,
Yeah, go ahead. It's very evenly divided, I would say. The thing, you know, Okinawa was just, you look, the 1st Marine Division had 4 campaigns of World War II: Guadalcanal, Cape Gloucester, Peleliu, Okinawa. Okay. Of those 4, that's 4 amphibious landings. One of those landings was opposed. That was Peleliu. Okay. Every campaign, every battle was its own set of circumstances, its own, you know, it's its own unique situation. Some guys endured 3 of them. My dad went through 2 of them. It's interesting that I know from researching the book and researching the unpublished material from his manuscript, I don't, you know, Peleliu, the degree of the violence was shocking, unrelenting, horrific to a stupendous degree. And then Okinawa got off to a slow start. The landing was unopposed. You know, Peleliu, my dad was 2nd wave ashore. Okinawa, he was 9th wave ashore. Unopposed landing for everybody. They moved inland. They're seeing these bucolic farmland scenes of, you know, farming shacks and little farms, and, you know, a lot of them had been abandoned because the civilians obviously had pulled out. But there were no Japanese anywhere that they could see. Obviously, when they got south, when they turned south on Okinawa, and the Army ran into some stiff resistance before the Marines did, you know, then the action picked up, and it became the same grinding war of attrition and the same horrific experience. You know, on Peleliu, you had a lot of heat and a little bit of rain. Okinawa, you had very little heat, but monsoon-like rains.
Yes, sir.
You know, ridiculous amounts of mud. My father said that mud just made your life pure hell. It was absolute misery to deal with. It just complicated everything. And yet Okinawa still had all the bad attributes that Peleliu had, all the bad aspects that were at Peleliu. I know my dad said that he would never go back to Peleliu, but and he actually said this in an interview. He didn't say this to me. He said, I actually would be very interested to go to Okinawa one day. That could be very interesting. But
Did he ever make it
Peleliu,
back?
go ahead.
Did he ever make it back to Okinawa?
He did not. He did not. Now, when I went to Peleliu in 1999, and my friend Saul David, the British historian and author who wrote this book, Devil Dogs, which is an excellent book. It's from King Company, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, from Guadalcanal to the shores of Japan. Saul wrote this about K-35. My father's a huge character in it. And Saul's a good friend of mine. We were on a panel together. I got to put in a plug for it. He let me write the foreword to it.
Outstanding.
So, but it's a really good book. But Saul loves the story I tell when I got in on the 55th anniversary trip to Peleliu in 1999. Okay. The tour organizers, when they saw the name Sledge, they were really excited. We got a Sledge on the trip. It's Eugene Sledge's son. And they called me and they said, if your father wants to go, it's all expenses paid. We'd be honored if he would come along. And my dad was still in pretty good health at that point, because this was actually like 2 years before he passed away. We didn't even know he was sick at that point. But I told him that, and he said, "Yeah, I've already had an all expense paid trip to Peleliu." So he demurred on that. But
that's amazing. That's just such a great line. That's definitely a PFC humor right there. That's awesome.
Yeah, well, if you, and my dad kind of had that biting sense of humor sometimes. So Dale Dye,
Yes,
the who trained. So when Saving Private Ryan came out in 1998, Dale Dye called my dad. Oh, and now this is 12 years before the Pacific, right?
Yes, sir.
Captain Dye called my dad and I guess they were really proud of what they'd done with Saving Private Ryan, because in my opinion, it was a great movie. I really enjoyed it. But training the actors and getting them ready and putting them through some tough training and some tough physical indoctrination, where they were getting these guys ready to try to just get a glimpse of what the people they were portraying had been through. But Dale Dye called my dad, because my dad told me this, and was encouraging him. He was exhorting my dad to go see Saving Private Ryan because of the degree of realism. And my father told me, he said, "Dale, there's a better chance of me going in the kitchen and put my hand on a hot stove than there is of going and seeing that damn movie." And I can just imagine, Dale dying. "Oh, but yeah, it's really realistic. It's incredibly realistic." My dad was like, "Yeah, I've already seen it. Okay,
Yeah,
I've already seen
go.
it. I've lived it. I don't need to see your movie."
Understood.
But that was just my dad's attitude about movies. He had very little time for them.
I can understand that. You had mentioned something when you were discussing the Okinawan campaign, and you used the term that resonates with me, and you called it a grind or grinding.
Mm-hmm.
And it's been many years since I read your father's book. I first read it as a young officer when I was in the airborne, and it was, I recollect, it was a grind to finish, not because it wasn't compelling. It's a wonderfully written book. It's probably the best book written by for firsthand combat experience, in my opinion. But just the information and the experience your dad had to convey, he pulls you into that grind. And it wasn't a grind because it was boring. It was a grind because it was exhausting just reading about what they had to deal with, let alone imagining what it felt like to have to live it.
Can to speak to that, Ben, could I pull a couple passages from With the Old? This is, on Okinawa, and it's so much gets, Peleliu's had so many books written about it, deservedly so. And it got great attention in the Pacific miniseries, but man, Okinawa was just horrific in its own right. Let me just read, and I hope your listeners don't mind me doing this. I mean, I'm trying to give you original material, not just ape what my dad did here.
Yeah, please do.
But this is so compelling. I mean, this in these words, it is the essence of what we're talking about here. Okay, So here's what my dad says. This is on Okinawa. After digging in the gun, registering in on the aiming stakes, and preparing ammo for future use, I had my first opportunity to look around our position. It was the most ghastly corner of hell I'd ever witnessed. As far as I could see, an area that previously had been a low, grassy valley with a picturesque stream meandering through it was a muddy, repulsive, open sore on the land. The place was choked with the putrefaction of death, decay, and destruction. In a shallow defilade to our right, between my gun pit and the railroad, lay about 20 dead Marines, each on a stretcher and covered to his ankles with a poncho, a commonplace, albeit tragic, scene to every veteran. Those bodies had been placed there to await transport to the rear for burial. At least those dead were covered from the torrents of rain that had made them miserable in life and from the swarms of flies that sought to hasten their decay. But as I looked about, I saw that other Marine dead couldn't be tended properly. The whole area was pocked with shell craters and churned up by explosions. Every crater was half full of water, and many of them held a Marine corpse. The bodies lay pathetically just as they had been killed, half submerged in muck and water, rusting weapons still in hand. Swarms of big flies hovered about them. And then he goes on. Here's another little paragraph, very close to that, shorter paragraph. The mud was knee deep in some places, probably deeper in others if one dared venture there. For several feet around every corpse, maggots crawled about in the muck and then were washed away by the runoff of the rain. There wasn't a tree or bush left. All was open country. Shells had torn up the turf so completely, the ground cover was non-existent. The rain poured down on us as evening approached. The scene was nothing but mud, shell fire, flooded craters with their silent, pathetic, rotting occupants, knocked out tanks and Amtraks, and discarded equipment. Utter desolation. And then one last paragraph, if
Certainly.
I can.
Please.
I existed from moment to moment, sometimes thinking death would have been preferable. We were there in the depths of the abyss, the ultimate horror of war. During the fighting around the Umabrogel pocket on Peleliu, I had been depressed by the wastage of human lives. But in the mud and driving rain before Shuri, we were surrounded by maggots and decay. Men struggled and fought and bled in an environment so degrading, I believed we had been flung into hell's own cesspool.
Just the imagery, especially with the flies and the maggots, is still what has stuck with me. That when I think of your dad's writing, that those always come to the fore, because it's just it adds a level of verisimilitude and horror that you just don't get from fiction. You just don't get from a film. That's can only be conveyed by somebody who lived it.
Yeah, and as I think you asked about earlier, Ben, the duration. Okay, I mean, Peleliu was unrelentingly violent and shocking, but it was 31 days, and that's a long damn time to be in those circumstances. But Okinawa was near 3 months. I mean, my dad was in combat 82 days on Okinawa, being rained on for a great deal of that time. So, and the other thing was just as any combat veteran, I'm sure many of them have told you this, you may know this yourself. I, again, have never been in the military, so I will not try to speak from personal experience, but the just complete lack of decent sleep, that debilitating day after day after day, not getting enough rest, it certainly was a problem in the Pacific, because the Japanese were brilliant night fighters.
Yes, sir.
They fought by day, but then they infiltrated and moved around at night, and it just kept them from getting any kind of decent sleep.
No, it just the confluence between fear itself is exhausting, and then the physical conditions they're in, no ability to rest, the calorie deficiency they're probably operating under. I can't imagine being able to endure for 82 days. That's just
I can't either, and the inability to get yourself clean. I mean, if I go 2 days without a shower, I can't stand it. I mean, imagine, my dad, I've got the first letter he wrote to my grandmother when he came off the lines on Peleliu. And he'd carried the writing paper around in his pack, and One line in that letter says, I'm sorry about the condition of this letter, but I've carried it around in my pack for 32 days waiting on the chance to write you. And I just had, for the first time in a month, I've had the chance to take a shower and shave and get cleaned up.
Yes, sir. That's again, straight from the horse's mouth, as it were. So you just provided us with 3 gripping accounts from your dad, which just illustrates why his book is a classic, and how raw and honest it is. And as you've alluded to, it made its way into an HBO miniseries about the Pacific, as the experiences of a Marine that had been, made its way into literature, and therefore found its way into this miniseries. How did the family find out that HBO wanted to include his experiences as part of the script?
In 2004, early 2004, my brother and I were talking on the phone, and he told me that he had been getting some inquiries on the film rights to Dad's book, to With the Old Breed. And at that time, honestly, we weren't even sure. Somebody had bought the film right. You can buy the film rights to a book. This happens all the time, as we found out. You can buy the film rights to a book, and it can just sit there and nothing ever gets done with it. I mean, people buy film rights every day and they write scripts and they come up with ideas and creative things, but that doesn't mean that it's going to make it to a screen, But that was early 2004. And then by April of 2004, we were contacted and were told that HBO wanted to buy the film rights because Tom Hanks and Steven Spielberg were very interested in doing a companion piece to Band of Brothers for the guys in the Pacific. And so my mother and my brother didn't go on that trip. We were flown out to Hollywood in spring of 2004 and met with Bruce McKenna, who was one of the main writers and executive producers of Band of Brothers, and subsequently the Pacific. And Bruce and I become very good friends over the years. But Bruce, we sat down, we had dinner with him and Kirk Sadusky, who was with Playtone. And Bruce told us that he said, Tom and Steven want to do something for the guys in the Pacific. And so we're looking at doing a miniseries. We want to have, at that point in time, it was going to be 5 main characters, and it was going to be 13 parts long. That was the original concept. And as Bruce McKenna told us, he said, I had a meeting with Tom Hanks, and I took your dad's book in there, Henry, and I said, if you're going to do something on the Pacific, you've got to have With the Old Breed. It is a must. And so that is how, I guess that's a pretty good short answer on how we found out and how With the Old Breed came to be used as source material. And of course, the excellent Helmet for My Pillow by Robert Leckie,
Yes,
which I just reread last spring, and I'm probably going to reread it again soon here because it's a classic in its own right. That was also used as source material. And so instead of 5 characters, 13 parts, after the evolutionary process and the inevitable budget cuts and, I mean, it's it sounds like a war into itself trying to get a miniseries made. But the end result was 3 main characters and 10 parts, which is what we got, which is the Pacific.
And that premiered in 2009, if I'm not mistaken.
2010 came out in March of 2010. Okay. Yeah.
Gotcha. And so that's like a 6-year process from the time you first had dinner with these folks and found out they were interested in it all the way down the line to the premiere.
Yeah, well, so again, we had regular conversations with Bruce through the process. He did a great job of keeping us. I mean, it's almost like, if you have a daughter and her husband, and they're like, okay, we want to have grandchildren for you. We're going to have a baby for you. And it's like you hear every step of the process, and you probably hear more than you want to hear. And then you're like, look, stop. I just want to see the baby, and yes, it was almost like that watching the Pacific come into, become extant because it was not, I mean, Bruce told us, he said, look, this is what we want to do. Right now, Tom Hanks is very excited about it. And we got to keep him excited about it. And there's no guarantee that even with that, he said, there's no guarantee, because what has to happen is we will write these scripts, we'll create this story, we'll essentially like build the shell of the house, okay? But we won't move in and finish out the house and move the furniture in and make it livable until it gets greenlit.
Certainly.
Well, it gets greenlit when HBO says, okay, we agree. We're going to give you the 200 million or 250 million, as it ended up being for the Pacific. We agree. We greenlight it. And I remember the day that happened, and that didn't happen until 2008.
Yes, sir.
So it was 4 years of creative writing and conceptualizing. And, you know, I mean, I had conversations with Bruce about, well, we're thinking about doing this with this character, and, well, we're going to get rid of this character. And, you know, I saw, or I didn't see it, I was witness to it, you know, if you will, through phone conversations with Bruce.
Understood.
Because he did a great job of keeping us up to date. And, you know, it was, at times it was a close run thing. I mean, I'll be honest with you, Ben, when Flags of Our Fathers came out in 2006, you know, that's an excellent movie, but it did not do well at the box office. And Tom Hanks was very concerned about that. And I remember Bruce telling us, you know, Tom called me and was like, "Well, is World War II still relevant? Do we need to do this? You know, we need to look at this." And Bruce got him back on track and said, "No, Tom, we absolutely need to do this." and thank God he did do that, you know. And then Tom got back on board, and, you know, it was haze gray and underway, as my Navy buddies say, you know.
Yes, sir. Now, were you, so since you bore witness to the process, as you said, were you invited to the premiere or anything like that? Were you?
Yeah. Yes. So we were invited to Hollywood when it premiered, the main premiere in Hollywood. They did another premiere in New Orleans, which we attended at the World War II Museum.
Yes.
And I think there was one in Mobile as well. Yeah, there was. It was a premiere in Mobile. And there were other premieres. They did one in Atlanta. They did, you know, they did premieres all over. But, you know, I know on the front end of it, you know, there's all these grandiose, oh, like, yeah, they may do one in Pearl Harbor, and you guys will go to that. Yeah, bullshit. That didn't happen, you know, or maybe it happened, but we were not invited to it. But
I got you.
I mean, you know, the accountants get in there and just start ripping everything apart.
I understand.
You know, but yeah, we went to, I think there were 3 premieres that I went to. The only one, well, I met Tom Hanks in Hollywood, of course, and then met him again in New Orleans, you know, but I mean, man, that's a situation to itself. I mean, New Orleans was the second premiere, and he literally flew into town, came over to the World War II Museum for a red carpet event, you know, hung out. He stood around. Of course, this big photo op, you know, everybody's got to have their picture taken with Tom Hanks. And wonderful guy, very gracious guy. It was great to meet him. He had some wonderful things to say about my dad. He was a huge fan of my dad's book. And he remembered meeting me there after having met me in Hollywood, you know, and that was pretty cool. But then, you know, after the little meet and greet and have a glass of champagne with Tom, and then he got back on his jet and had to be out somewhere else, you know, while we went to the theater and saw the, you know, the premiere of the first episode.
Yeah, I can't imagine the demands on a man like that's time. So it totally makes sense. Now, I certainly don't want you to, you know, I don't want to say bite the hand that feeds you, because that's not even appropriate here, but you are friends with the people who created this product. But in your honest opinion, do you think they did your dad justice?
Yes.
Okay.
I do. And I'll look, Bruce McKenna, like I said, he and I have become really good friends through the years. I saw him at the 20th anniversary symposium at the New Orleans World War II Museum last August. Okay. He came in for that when they had all the Band of Brothers actors in for a reunion. And I've been on a couple podcasts with him too, here in the last year and a half or so. When the Pacific, and Bruce and I've talked about this, you know, we laugh about it now. When it first came out, I didn't like it. And it's not that didn't feel like they did my dad justice. I never felt like that. But there were things that got changed, and it just it was hard for me to kind of square with that. Not anything, morally or really structural to the story, just little details. And I've since come to realize, as I have learned more about, how movies are made, and I've learned a little bit more about the book writing process. Um, they have to compress events. They have to have composite characters. They have to do those things, because you've got all these pages in a book to tell a story. You've only got so much screen time, and you've got to tell as much of that as you can. And so there has to be artistic license, and I understand that now. And but I think they did an excellent job with the Pacific. I wish certain things had been done differently. I mean, sure, and like I said, Bruce and I've had that conversation. He'll say that, but I think they did my dad justice. I think it's an excellent miniseries. I wish everybody would watch it. Parts of it are hard to watch. What I hear, and not that we're going to do, let's compare Band of Brothers to the Pacific, but the Pacific explored thematically some things that Band of Brothers did not. I would describe the Pacific as being more beneath the rim of the helmet, and those are actually the words that Richard Frank, who is I think a paramount scholar of the Pacific War, those are exactly the words he used, and he was a chief consultant to HBO for the Pacific miniseries. But with the Pacific, you explore more of, they don't use the term post-traumatic stress syndrome, but that's really what it is when you look at some of the struggles that the Sledge character has when he comes home.
Yes, sir.
And it explores more of that, the psychological cost of that war experience, that maybe Band of Brothers did not explore. I love Band of Brothers. I think it's great. I've watched it a million times, but it's funny when the Pacific, I took a long break from all of it, like about an 11-year break. And when I came back around to it, like about a year and a half ago, and really began to re-engage with the World War II community, I just sat down with a fresh pair of eyes, and watched the miniseries like I'd never seen it before, and I loved it. And in fact, I just started watching it again. I've watched it, many, 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 many times since then, and I just started a rewatch here a few nights ago. But it's a tough thing to, in a 10-part miniseries, to cover the panoply of the Pacific War.
Yes, sir.
It's not to belittle the experience, but in Europe, you land in France, push east, go to Germany. I mean, that's a gross oversimplification of it, but strategically and tactically and geographically, it is a little bit neater and tidier to understand. Plus, Band of Brothers, you had unit integrity, Easy Company, 2nd Battalion, 506.
Yes, sir.
The Pacific, I remember Bruce telling me that Steven Spielberg really wanted to cover the panoply of the Pacific War, of the whole war. And that's tough because everything is geographically so spread out and so disparate, and there was no one unit that covered everything. I mean, you can't get Pearl Harbor all the way to Okinawa with one set of guys. It just wasn't possible. So they did it the way they did it. They had the formula, 3 main characters, and I think it worked very well.
I think they did it beautifully. I almost think of it like a relay. From you start with the true old breed, the pre-war professionals,
right?
You get them through Guadalcanal, and then you've got Robert in the middle, and then you're
kind of exactly. Yeah, you got Lecky, who's at Guadalcanal and Cape Gloucester, and of course Basilone obviously was a main character. Basilone was a huge figure on Guadalcanal, but then he went home, so Lecky kind of carried it with Cape Gloucester, and then that takes them up to 1st Marine Division, getting to Pavuvu, to rest and refit and train up for their next operation, which was going to be Peleliu, and then enter Eugene Sledge.
Yes, sir. I mean, I think they handled it beautifully as well, and I'm really thrilled that you shared your own experiences with that production, which leads me to kind of my big question. I mean, we've had an hour-long lead up into it, but It seems like you've re-engaging with the World War II community, to use your terms.
Mm-hmm.
You're doing a lot to carry your dad's legacy forward and share it with a new generation. And so and you're working on a pretty exciting project to do just that. So do you mind sharing a little bit about what you're working on with us?
Yeah, well, I do what I can. Ben, I when I first got back into all this, I was fortunate enough to be invited to be on some various podcasts and Zoom shows. Some of those things are We Happy Few 506. I've got some good friends, Matt Leach and Leighton Hughes, who run that operation. Matt Leach, of course, was one of the actors in Band of Brothers, but they've had me on their podcast and on their show a couple of times. Uh, uh, I've been invited to be on other podcasts. I became a co-host of one of the podcasts I guested on twice, called What's the Scuttlebutt, WTSP, What's the Scuttlebutt podcast. And I co-host that with two other gentlemen. And I think we've got a great thing going because the three of us have a passion for World War II history and movies and books and models and paraphernalia and all of it. And we have various authors and historians and in some cases actors come on, and creators, and we just have we always try to have a really compelling conversation about World War II themed topics. Probably what I I like to do more than anything is to write. I mentioned Devil Dogs by Saul David. I was fortunate enough to be invited to read his manuscript, and then he invited me to write the foreword to it, which I did. I also, the autumn issue of World War II magazine, I wrote the cover story, and that story was essentially about. This is the article right here, but basically what it's about is kind of the theme for that article was we hear of inter-service rivalry, Army versus Marines, Marines versus Army, all that kind of thing. My basic point in that article is, despite all of that, which was very real and very, very extant and very palpable, despite all of that, when it came down to it, the Marines and the Army worked together very well.
Yes, sir.
It doesn't mean there weren't difficulties. Somebody might want to remind me about the Smith versus Smith controversy on Saipan. Well, I'm very aware of that
That'll probably
because
come
I
up in the
mentioned it
comments.
in my article. I'm very aware of that. But again, I say, when it came down to it, soldiers and Marines usually did their job together very well. That doesn't mean there weren't differences. That doesn't mean they didn't get pissed off at each other, but they got the job done together.
Roger that.
And I did make that point in my article. I was really just super stoked to be able to get an article published in World War II magazine. I definitely want to do more of that. So I mentioned earlier the Marine Fighter Squadron VMF 114 that was at Peleliu.
Yes, sir.
There, I just have to tell you, everybody's got that one thing that they love, that one piece of World War II gear, that one thing that just really gets them going. Man, I love the World War II flight gear. I love World War II airplanes. Corsairs to me are just like handing chocolate to an addict. Okay, I freaking love Corsairs. So marine aviation in World War II is like a subgenre of my passion. I've been fortunate enough in the last year and a few months to become friends, very close friends, with the distant cousin of the commander of VMF 114 from World War II.
Wow.
His name was Robert Stout, Major Robert Stout. They called him Cowboy because he was from Laramie, Wyoming. But Cowboy Stout was the Marine Fighter Squadron commander of VMF 114. He was a 6-kill ace. He had shot down 6 Japanese airplanes during the fighting in the Solomon Islands as an F4F pilot. And then was given command of VMF 114 sometime before the Battle of Peleliu. He commanded VMF 114 brilliantly through Peleliu. The sad thing about the Robert Stout story is that March 4th of 1945, which is long after my dad and his buddies and the soldiers from the 81st Division had left Peleliu and gone on to their next campaign. I'm not sure where the 81st went, but I know, obviously the 1st Marine Division by early March of 1945 was about to go. They had probably already sailed for Ulithi Atoll, where they were joining the Armada to sail for Okinawa.
Yes, sir.
Well, VMF 114 was left on Peleliu and continued flying. Peleliu became their base, and they continued flying missions against Japanese ground forces in the northern Palau Islands. And Major Stout, Robert Cowboy Stout, on March 4th, I believe it was, of 1945, was shot down by flak over Koror in the northern Palau Islands, and was missing for 2 years. And then they found his remains and his Corsair 2 years later. 2 Palauan fishermen, it was 2 ladies who were fishing, 2 Palauan women, found his body still strapped in his Corsair out in the jungle. And his cousin, Damon Stout, who I've become very good friends with, is making a documentary film about Cowboy. And Damon has very kindly asked me to collaborate with him on that, because I called him when I found out how to get in touch with him, when I happened upon something about it on the internet. And I didn't expect him to answer me back. I was just saying, hey, man, Cowboy Stout is a hero of mine. Because he was this, there's some cool pictures of him, because being an ace, there's a little bit written about him. And
Sure.
he was this dashingly handsome guy. He looked like Errol Flynn. He had the Errol Flynn mustache, and just, man, he looked so cool in his flight gear, I mean, the guy was a hero to me, because I knew he was flying close air support for guys like my dad.
Heck yeah.
But when I found out, well, the cousin of Cowboy Stout is making a film about him called Cowboy Down, I traced it through and sent Damon Stout an email, never expecting him to respond. I was just saying, look, man, I'm stoked. When is this thing coming out? I want to see it. Well, we end up having a phone conversation that turned into 2 and then 3 conversations. And he was just like, he immediately sensed my passion for the subject. And it was kind of cool that I was Eugene Sledge's son, because he had heard of the Pacific and heard of my dad. And he was very gracious enough to say, hey, why don't you collaborate with me on this? So I was just like, hell yeah, I'll jump into the deep end of the pool with no life jacket on, man. Let's go, So we are working on a documentary film about Cowboy Stout. Not sure when it's coming out. We're working on it. As I have already learned, that filmmaking, can be a long birthing process. But that's a project that I've been involved in, and I'm really excited about. And then probably the biggest one of all, Ben, as you and George and I talked about the other night, With the Old Breed, my dad's book, was published at 312 pages. The original manuscript for With the Old Breed, typewritten, was 820 pages. And this in itself is a story, and I'll try to make it really short. But my mom, who has since passed away, sadly, but October of 21, we were having a conversation, and she just said, your dad's original unedited manuscript With the Old Breed is in the closed section of his papers at Auburn University archives. And I think there's a lot of material there that didn't make it into the published book. You ought to see if you could do something with that. Long story short, I contacted the archivist there, Greg Schmidt. He was very gracious, very helpful, very courteous. He made it possible for me to get that original unedited, or a copy of it. Okay, the original unedited typed manuscript. So I took that, I printed it out. He sent it to me on a PDF. I printed it out, and then started going through it with a highlighter in one hand and the book in the other, and I highlighted everything that wasn't published. And I wore out maybe 5 highlighters.
I can imagine.
So
100 pages.
Yeah. So, and here's the thing: I'm not by any means suggesting that there's 500 pages of grade A stuff that should have never been cut. I'm not saying that. Some of it should have been cut for brevity and clarity or whatever. But if the story like I do, if you have an appreciation for it like I do. I mean, I have said when I spoke at the World War II International World War II Conference and at the World War II Museum in November in New Orleans, you know, With the Old Breed is literally part of my DNA. I grew up watching this book being written. Uh, being 5 years old, 6 years old, and seeing my dad sit up by the fireplace writing on those yellow legal pads that turned into, the manuscript that turned into With the Old Breed. I watched it come to life. And I didn't just watch it come to life, but I loved that history because I was really into World War II stuff as a kid. You know, Hogan's Heroes and movies like, Patton and Battle of the Bulge. I mean, I grew up on that stuff, man. And if I could have known then that my dad was writing what was going to become one of the classic infantryman memoirs of all time, it still is mind blowing to me now, and I live with the knowledge of it every day. But to be as intimately familiar with the story, with the Old Breed, with the book, with the bloodline of it, and to not only that, but have a passion of Pacific War history, World War II history in general, but especially the Pacific, obviously. It's very easy for me to take those unpublished nuggets and flesh them out into a book of my own, and that's what I'm doing. That's what I'm working on. And there's a very well published, very well known military historian named John McManus, who's a very good friend of mine. And John is a big ally of mine and a huge cheerleader for me and a consultant. And I've sought his advice and will continue to. Right now, I'm just trying to get through the first draft, and I'm working on it. But when you've got a 14-year-old who plays 3 sports and a full-time job and all the other stuff, man, I mean, I don't have all day every day I can work on it, but I'm
You've
doing
got a
what I
great
can.
example to follow in how your dad did it.
Yeah, because I mean, he didn't. It's not like he wrote the book and just said, "Screw it, I'm not working anymore. I don't have to work." That's not how it was. In fact, he retired from teaching in 1990, about 10 years after the book came out.
Amazing.
Actually, but that's what I want to do, man, is I want to get my own book out there with those. I want the heart of it to be the unpublished material from the original With the Old Breed manuscript. But I want to flesh in those episodic parts with my own voice, reminiscing about him as a dad, growing up, reminiscing about some of the conversations we had. I mean, like behind me up there on the wall, you can see a Japanese bayonet, and get my finger in the right place, a Japanese bayonet and his K-bar knife. We had so many cool conversations about stuff like that. That's his dungaree jacket right there, a Japanese flag that he took out of a Japanese soldier's pack on Okinawa. And, we had conversations about all that stuff. I mean, most of the things With the Old Breed, he and I talked about when I was a kid. So I have that pool of knowledge and that perspective. In addition to I think I've got a fairly good grasp of World War II history because I speak about it quite a bit and have done a little bit of writing on it now and hope to do more. And so I want to put all that into the pot and stir it up and try to create my own book that, I hope will be compelling and interesting for a lot of people. I don't know if I can pull that off, but I'm going to try.
Well, it's going to be exciting to watch you do it, Henry, seriously. And I really appreciate you making the time to come on the show and share with us what you're doing. Any final thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I want to say thanks for having me on, and I'm on Instagram at @HSledgehammer. I'm on Facebook too, but it's yeah, I love World War II history, man. I love talking to people like you who want to keep something alive and moving forward. And that's what I love about George Luz, man, my buddy George Luz Jr. I mean, he's doing the same thing I'm doing. We're carrying that legacy on into the future.
You've done
So
a wonderful job of it, that's for sure. And as you indicated a few nights ago, Luz and I were able to talk, and I'm really looking forward to getting the two of you back on the show together to talk.
yeah, that's going to be fun.
So, but guys, thanks for tuning into the Commander's Voice. My guest has been Henry Sledge, son of Eugene Sledge, World War II combat Marine and author of With the Old Breed. As indicated, Henry's an author, excellent amateur historian, filmmaker, podcaster, and just a great guy. And I count him as a new friend. So, Henry, thanks for coming on the show tonight.
You bet, Ben. It's been a pleasure, man. Thanks.
All right, take care. Bye-bye.